I never thought my life would turn upside down like this. My wife and I were together for 6 years, married for most of it. Everything seemed perfect. We had our dreams, our plans, and most importantly, we both wanted a family. Right after marriage, we started talking about having kids. She would spend hours looking at baby clothes online, discussing names, and planning how we decorate the nursery. It was our favorite topic, something that kept us close. We were ready to start our family, but life had other plans. After trying for several months without success, we decided to see a doctor. That's when everything changed. The doctor told us I had a medical condition that made it nearly impossible for us to have children naturally. The news hit me hard, and I fell into depression. At first, my wife acted supportive, saying she was happy with just the two of us. But something felt off about how quickly she changed her mind. One day, she was dreaming about baby names, and the next day, she didn't want to discuss kids at all. Not only that, but her behavior towards me started changing too. She began making small comments about my appearance, suggesting I should exercise more or be more active around the house. When I asked her about these changes, she would say I was being too sensitive. The woman I married, who used to spend hours talking about our future, had become distant. She wasn't exactly mean, but there was this coldness in her behavior. Over time, I stopped bringing up these issues because I didn't want to seem insecure. We fell into a routine where we barely talked about anything important, living more like roommates than a married couple. I tried suggesting adoption or surrogacy, but she would shut down these conversations immediately. She kept saying she was happy with how things were, but it never felt genuine. It was like she was trying to convince herself more than me. We used to do everything together, weekend trips, movie nights, even grocery shopping. But slowly, all of that stopped. She started spending more time on her phone, often walking out of the room to take calls. I noticed these changes but kept telling myself it was just a phase. Then one day, she announced she wanted to go on a trip to Seattle with her friends. It wasn't unusual. She had gone on trips before, and I always supported her. I even helped her pack and drove her to the airport. The last thing she said was, "Thank you for being so understanding." I thought it was a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, I stayed up waiting for her message saying she had landed safely. The flight was supposed to take 5 hours. When I saw that her flight had landed, I called her, but there was no answer. I figured she was tired and had gone straight to her hotel. But when morning came and I still hadn't heard from her, I started worrying. I called her sister, but she hadn't heard anything either. Then I called her friends, the ones who were supposed to be on the trip with her. They were confused because they weren't on any trip. They were right here in town, going about their normal day. That's when reality hit me. There was no trip with friends. She had just disappeared. I sat there trying to make sense of it all. Why would she lie? Why would she leave without saying anything? I tried to convince myself there must be some explanation, but deep down, I knew she had planned this. The whole trip story, thanking me for being understanding, it was all part of her plan to leave. The next few days were a blur. I kept calling her phone, leaving messages, hoping to hear something, anything. But there was only silence. Her family was as shocked as I was. They had no idea about her plans. Her mom would let me stay at their house sometimes, make me food when I couldn't bring myself to cook. We would sit there, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so suddenly. I looked through our photos, our messages, trying to find some sign I might have missed. Everything in our apartment reminded me of her, the coffee mug she always used, her side of the closet still full of clothes, the fancy cooking equipment she bought but rarely used. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I spent nights wondering if I could have done something differently, if I had somehow pushed her away without realizing it. My friends tried to help, but how do you explain to people that your wife didn't just leave, she vanished? I couldn't even file a missing person report because she had clearly planned this. She had taken her passport, some cash, and important documents. It wasn't a disappearance, it was an escape, and I was left behind to pick up the pieces of a life we built together, trying to understand where it all went wrong. The first month after she left was the hardest. I couldn't focus at work, barely ate, and sleep felt impossible. People would ask if I was okay, and I'd just say I was dealing with personal stuff. It was embarrassing to admit that my wife had disappeared without a word. My friend Marcus finally convinced me to tell a few close friends what had happened. They tried their best to keep me distracted, inviting me to basketball games, hosting movie nights, anything to get me out of the house. But even when I was with them, my mind would drift back to her. I kept wondering where she was, what she was doing, and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. The worst part was answering questions from people who didn't know. Neighbors, distant relatives, old co-workers, they'd ask about her, and I'd just smile and say everything was fine. Each lie felt heavier than the last. After 3 months of barely functioning, I knew I needed help. I found a therapist and started going every week. At first, I just talked about the anger and betrayal. How could someone just walk away from 6 years like they meant nothing? The therapist helped me see things differently. She hadn't just left on a whim. The signs had been there for months. I'd ignored them, hoping things would get better on their own. I started seeing how much of myself I'd lost in our marriage. I was always the one making an effort, always trying to keep things perfect. Now I had all this free time, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I started small, went back to the gym, picked up reading again, learned to cook proper meals. Work got better too. I put more effort into my job, and it paid off. I got a promotion I probably wouldn't have gotten if I'd stayed stuck feeling sorry for myself. My friend Jake suggested I join his weekend hiking group. At first, I made excuses, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. It turned out to be exactly what I needed: fresh air, new people, and conversations that had nothing to do with my failed marriage. Through the group, I met people who knew nothing about my past, who just knew me as me, not as the guy whose wife left him. Some days were still hard. I'd find something that reminded me of her, an old movie ticket, a photo, or just something small that brought back memories. I'd look at these things and wonder if she ever thought about me, if she ever regretted what she did. But those moments started getting shorter. Each time, it was a little easier to put those memories away and move on. The biggest change came when I finally cleaned out her side of the closet. Her mom had asked if she could pick up some of her daughter's things. I agreed, thinking it would help me move forward. As I packed her stuff into boxes, I realized how much space I'd let her take up, both physically and mentally. After her mom took the boxes, the apartment felt different. Empty at first, but then peaceful. It was like I could finally breathe again. I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen much since getting married. My college buddy Tom and I started playing tennis again. Another friend, Chris, got me into photography. I was building a life that was completely my own, not defined by being someone's husband or by what I'd lost. Looking back, I realized I'd put too much of myself into that relationship. When she left, it felt like she'd taken a part of me with her. But slowly, I was finding myself again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I was getting there. By the end of that year, I could look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by what she'd done. I was more than just the guy whose wife left him. I had survived, rebuilt, and come out stronger. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually live my life without her shadow hanging over me. I even felt proud of how far I'd come. I thought I'd finally put everything behind me. Life had started feeling normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could get. I had my routine down, friends keeping me busy, and work was going great. I'd even stopped thinking about her every day. Sure, I still had moments where some random memory would sneak up on me, but it wasn't like before where every second of my life somehow connected back to her. I was finally at peace with my new life. That's why, when there was a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I stood frozen at my door, staring at her like I was seeing a ghost. She looked almost the same, maybe a bit tired, but still her. She gave me this look like she expected me to be happy to see her. That hit me hard because even though I thought I was over everything, seeing her again brought back feelings I thought I'd buried. She smiled at me like nothing had happened and asked if she could come in. The nerve of this woman. After everything she'd done, she thought she could just walk back into my life like nothing had changed. I told her to stay right where she was and explain herself. I wasn't about to let her into my house, the one place I'd managed to rebuild after she'd torn my life apart. She looked surprised but stayed where she was and started her story. I know this might be a shock, but I wanted to come back and explain everything. She had this hopeful look on her face like she really believed I'd want to hear her out. I was torn between laughing and shutting the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what excuse she'd come up with. She went on about how she'd made a mistake in leaving, how she'd realized she'd lost the best thing that ever happened to her. According to her, after having the baby, she finally understood what really mattered in life. Then she looked down at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our second chance? Like this baby was some magic reset button that would make me forget everything she'd done? I kept my face blank, but inside I was furious. She continued talking about how we could be a family again, how she'd made a terrible mistake, but now we could start fresh. Finally, I asked the one question that had eaten at me for years. Why did you leave? She hesitated, looking down at her feet, but eventually told me the truth. She admitted she'd left because she wanted a kid, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone who could. She said it like it was no big deal, like she hadn't completely shattered my life. She explained that the guy she left with hadn't stuck around, but by then she'd had the baby and realized she wanted me back. Just like that, simple. I took a minute to process what she was saying. She'd abandoned me, run off with some guy, had his kid, and now expected me to be okay with it. So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back and pretend like nothing happened? She started crying, saying she was sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake. It didn't move me at all. She kept saying how she realized I was the one she truly loved and that we were meant to be together. Then she tried to make herself the victim, going on about how hard it was being a single mom and how difficult things had been for her. She actually tried to guilt-trip me, as if her choices hadn't led to exactly where she was now. She said she needed my support, that she was ready to make things work this time. The whole time, I just kept thinking, who does she think I am? I looked at her and said, "You made your choice a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." She looked stunned, like she never considered I might say no. Like she really thought she could just walk back into my life because it was convenient for her. And then, just when I thought she'd finally get it and leave, she got angry. Her whole tone changed, and she started yelling about how I was being selfish, that I owed her a chance to make things right. She even brought up how she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. She had the nerve to mention the house, saying it should still be partly hers. It was like her true colors were coming out right in front of me, and honestly, I felt relieved. I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "We're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore." With that, I shut the door, cutting off whatever she was about to say next. Standing there, hearing her muffled shouts from the other side, I felt strangely calm. She could knock, yell, cry, whatever she wanted. I knew I'd never let her back in. After I closed the door on her, I thought that would be it. I figured she'd get the message and leave. Instead, she started banging on the door and yelling. I opened it again, just a crack, curious about what else she had to say. She looked shocked that I hadn't given in to her demands. She started this whole speech about how she was willing to forgive me for shutting the door on her and how we could start fresh. Like we were just having some small argument, not dealing with her abandonment. She went on about how we could make things work if we both tried. I actually laughed because I couldn't believe how delusional she was being. That made her angry. She started saying things like, "You don't understand how hard it's been for me." She talked about how lost she'd felt after leaving and how she'd realized too late that she'd made a mistake. But I wasn't buying it. I told her that leaving was her choice. She'd planned it, lied about it, and gone through with it. Her regret now meant nothing. That's when she showed her true colors. She dropped the sad act and started going off about how unfair I was being, how I didn't have the decency to give her another chance. She even had the nerve to say, "If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own." I just stood there amazed. This woman who'd left me without a word now thought she deserved credit for not trying to ruin me financially. Like I should be grateful she'd only abandoned me and not taken my stuff too. All those years I'd spent feeling guilty, questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow responsible for her leaving, they disappeared right there. When she saw I wasn't budging, she got even louder. She started pacing on my porch, saying I'd never find anyone like her and how I'd regret not giving her another chance. Then she tried to blame me, saying if I'd been more understanding about wanting kids, none of this would have happened. According to her, my inability to have children meant I'd failed as a husband, which somehow justified her running off to have a baby with someone else. I told her straight up, if you want a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your exit. She had nothing to say to that, just stared at me. I continued, you made that choice all on your own, and now you've got to live with it. That's not my problem. She tried one last angle, switching back to her sad face and asking me to think about the child, saying I was being unfair to him. She actually used the baby to try to guilt-trip me. But I wasn't falling for it. I told her, I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you. Finally, it seemed to sink in. She realized I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way I'd let her back into my life. I could see the anger fading from her face, replaced by what looked like actual regret. But it didn't matter to me anymore. She was just a stranger now, someone who tried to use me and expected me to thank her for it. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She apologized for her daughter's behavior, saying she was ashamed of how she'd handled everything. Her mom had always been good to me, helped me a lot after her daughter left, and I could tell she was genuinely upset. I just replied with a polite thank you and left it at that. I wasn't interested in getting pulled back into their family drama. Through mutual friends, I started hearing bits about her life. She'd moved back in with her parents, and things weren't going well. The baby's father wasn't in the picture at all. He'd completely disappeared when things got serious. Now she was stuck figuring everything out on her own. Most of her old friends wanted nothing to do with her. They'd moved on with their lives and weren't interested in dealing with her problems. I heard her parents weren't too happy either. They weren't in a position to support her and a baby, and they made that clear to her. This wasn't the life she planned when she'd run off, and now she was facing the consequences of her choices. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd finally found my peace, and I wasn't about to let her mess that up again. Soon after her parents contacted me, her friends started reaching out too. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had my number. A few tried to make me feel guilty, saying she was having a rough time and maybe I could find it in my heart to help. One of her friends, Sarah, even suggested that the baby needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness get in the way. I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for choosing myself. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she'd thrown it away. The least she could do was own her choices instead of trying to make me fix her mistakes. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down. Eventually, they stopped completely. It was like everyone finally understood that I was serious about moving on. That's when I found real peace. My life felt quiet and normal in a way it hadn't in years. I had my routines, my friends, and my work. It wasn't exciting or dramatic, but it was mine, and I'd rebuilt it from scratch. I started finding happiness in small things, going for walks in the park, trying new recipes, reading books I'd been putting off for years. The freedom felt amazing. I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live the way I wanted. For once, I wasn't worried about someone else's approval or happiness. Sometimes I'd run into people who knew both of us, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened with your wife?" I'd give a short answer and change the subject. Not because I was hiding anything, but because that chapter of my life was over. She belonged in my past, and that's where I planned to keep her. Through the grapevine, I heard things weren't going well for her. She couldn't keep a steady job and kept moving between her parents' place and friends' couches. People I barely talked to anymore would message me occasionally, telling me she was asking for help from anyone who would listen. Some hinted that she was still hoping I'd change my mind and decide to help raise her kid. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd worked too hard to get my life back on track to even consider going down that road. I wasn't going to be her backup plan or safety net just because things hadn't worked out the way she wanted. That chapter was closed, and nothing was going to make me reopen it. My friend Marcus told me I should be proud of how I handled everything. He said most guys would have either taken her back out of guilt or gotten really bitter about the whole thing. But I'd managed to find a middle ground. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't a pushover either. I'd learned to value myself enough to say no to someone who'd hurt me, even when they came back begging for another chance. The funny thing is, after everything settled down, I felt grateful in a weird way. Not for what she did, that was still wrong, but for the life I'd built afterward. Before she left, I was so focused on being a good husband that I forgot about being myself. I'd lost touch with old friends, given up hobbies, stopped doing things I enjoyed. When she disappeared, it forced me to figure out who I was on my own. These days, my life is pretty simple. I work hard, spend time with friends who actually care about me, and do things I enjoy. I started traveling more, nothing fancy, just weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to visit. I joined a local sports league and made new friends who only know me as me, not as someone's ex-husband. Sometimes people ask if I'm dating again. I'm not in a rush. I've learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. I'm comfortable with my life now, and if someone comes along who adds to that, great. But I'm not looking to fill some empty space anymore. Looking back at everything, I realized that what hurt most wasn't just that she left. It was the way she left and then expected to come back like nothing happened. But in the end, she did me a favor. She showed me exactly who she was, and when she came back, she showed me who I'd become, someone strong enough to say no to toxic people, even when they come with a sad story and good memories. The last I heard, she was still struggling to get her life together. Some mutual friends say she talks about me sometimes, wondering what might have been if she'd made different choices. But that's her burden to carry, not mine. I've moved on, built something new, and found peace with my life. I won't say I'm happy all the time, nobody is. But I'm content in a way I never was when I was trying to keep someone else happy at my own expense. I've learned that real strength isn't about holding on to something that's hurting you. It's about having the courage to let go and start over. That's my story. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I built. And you know what? I wouldn't change it. Every struggle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, they all led me to become someone I'm actually proud to be. Someone who knows his worth and isn't afraid to stand up for himself. And that's worth more than any relationship that was built on lies.